This is the third cemetery project I've undertaken about 10 years ago because a lot of the stones are deteriorating in our cemeteries, not just here, but around New England. It's important to me that we record the history and what's on these wonderful old stones for the future. And so Stony Creek is the largest cemetery that I've surveyed so far. And I did this with Jay Greenwall. I gave him a call. I knew he was on the Stony Creek Cemetery Association. And we worked off and on, weather permitting, for about 2 years. My goal was to photograph every stone, to document all the burials in Stony Creek Cemetery. It's not that easy a task to even try to figure out who really is even buried here. And to do the genealogy of all those individuals buried. But for me, it's more about what the title is. Why do we have this cemetery in this particular community? Who's buried there? Why are they buried there? And what's the relationship between all these people at the cemetery, the families in this particular community? This project was really started 3 decades ago by the late Bo Collins. And he realized that there were a lot of burials in Stony Creek Cemetery that there was no documentation. So he really did a large amount of this work collating the Cemetery Association papers and working on this project. And so I sort of took it from there. And so what we did was looked at every gravestone. We had to figure out how we were going to name the locations because there's plot numbers in the cemetery. But within one plot, there might be more than one gravestone, and there certainly are more than one persons in each plot. And in some cases, there's up to a dozen people in a plot. So you can't really use the plot numbers to designate the gravestones. So we had to devise a new numbering system. What we found is that there are 716 burials up until the time that we wrote the book in Stony Creek Cemetery. Of those, 526 have their names on a gravestone. And so you can do the math. There's 433 gravestones. So there's a goodly number of people that their name was never on a stone. And those are the people that were most difficult to try to track. Now, as you may know, Stony Creek was settled in the early 1800s by the families Barker, Howard, Frisbee, Page, and so on. But the Stony Creek Cemetery wasn't founded until later. So those early Stony Creek settlers were buried in Damascus Cemetery. Damascus Cemetery, this is the first cemetery I did. This was established in 1812. So if you have Stony Creek ancestors, you may want to go here and look around because some of your ancestors will be in Damascus Cemetery. Among the Stony Creek people buried in Damascus are members of the Rogers family. The stone on your right is for Summy, which was the nickname for Sumner Rogers, and he drowned in the creek by the border of Guilford at the age of 8, bringing his father lunch. And the Rogers house is the John Rogers house, which still stands on Leeds Island Road toward the Guilford border. Another Stony Creek family in Damascus is the Barker family. They lived on Halls Point, and this is a monument in honor of Joseph Barker, who died in the Civil War, and he was in Company K of the 6th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. And just to mention one other family in Damascus Cemetery is the Palmer family, and they lived out Pave Street near where the Lasco farm is today. And Polly Palmer was the oldest person buried at Damascus Cemetery. You can see at the age of 95. And her story is my favorite. And her gravestone says, "She hath done all she could." But we're not here to talk about Damascus. We're here to talk about Stony Creek. And Stony Creek, as you know, has these beautiful cobblestone pillars with the fence, the metal fence, really makes a very picturesque scene. And how this cemetery is divided up, if you look at this photograph, in the far left corner, which would be the southwest corner, is the oldest section of the cemetery, where most of those Yankee families are buried. And then in the middle, pretty much down the center, is the Cornish English families that came to work at the quarries. You can see this really nice carved curbstone, probably carved by a Stony Creek quarryman, that kind of designates this area. And the cemetery has these rather wide paths throughout it, and those were there originally so that the hearse and the horses could get around the cemetery for the burials. And then in the far right section, or the eastern section of the cemetery, this is the newest section. There's a lot of flat stones flush to the ground in this section. For a while, upright stones weren't allowed in the cemetery, and this is where some of the newer burials are. And also in the northwest corner of the cemetery, there's a small section where it's newer, where there's a good number of cremations. So that's how the cemetery is sort of divided up. And the Cemetery Association uses the date of establishment is 1866. The reason for that is the oldest burial in the cemetery is for Alvin S. Bailey, and he died in 1866 at the age of 47. We can really not know for sure if this is when the cemetery started. This is the best that we can do based on the information. This is a period stone, so I believe the date that they use is about as correct as we can make it. This was not a stone that was added later. Now, Alvin Bailey's daughter, her name was Esther, and she married in 1857 John Whittlesey Brainerd from Turkey Hill in Haddam, Connecticut. And Esther and John came to Stony Creek about 1865, and they bought an existing house, enlarged it, and it became a hotel known as the Brainerd House. And Esther was known as a very good cook, and it was said that sometimes in the summer for Sunday dinner, 200 people would come to eat from Esther, the cook. Another one of John Whittlesey Brainerd's sisters, there was a large Brainerd family, came to Stony Creek also, and she married a member of the Page family. She's the second oldest person buried in Stony Creek Cemetery at the age of 99 years and 8 months, and unfortunately, her name never made it onto a stone. Now, John and Esther's son, Alvin, and his wife, Renee, are buried in the cemetery, as is their other son, Frank E. Brainerd, and his wife, Annie. And Frank started the Brainerd department store in 1883, and this was on Main Street, what's now called Thimble Islands Road. And this was started in 1883. It was the largest department store between New London and New Haven. And you can see the windmill that the Brainerd family owned that they used to help power and generate some electricity when that first came to town. Frank and Annie had a son, Harold. He's buried in Stony Creek Cemetery, as is their other son, John Elmer Brainerd. And many of you, I'm sure, remember John Brainerd. He was an important person here in Stony Creek, the leader of the Boy Scouts and so on. His wife, obviously, Evelyn, is buried with him. So and now some of their offspring are being buried in the cemetery. So 5 generations of the Brainerd family are here at the cemetery. This is the community and family that I'm speaking of. Another family that's buried here in the cemetery, John Whittlesey Brainerd's other sister, Anne Mariah, married George Wallace. And their son, Willoughby Wallace, built Seaside Hall, where the drum corps is today, and of course donated the land for this library to be built. And they're all buried at the cemetery. About 30 members of the Brainerd family are buried in the cemetery, including the Page and Wallace families. But the Brainards did not own the cemetery. The Hall family did. And this is very typical of what happened, particularly in small neighborhoods. This is what happened at Damascus Cemetery. One of the families allowed their land to be used as the cemetery. And it was actually the private land of the Hall family that owned the cemetery and allowed other Stony Creekers to be buried here. And Alonson Hall came to Stony Creek. He was an oyster dealer and a boat captain. and Hall's Point is named for this family. Another member of this family was Roger Hall. You can see his wife was Eliza Page of Stony Creek, and Roger Hall was a Civil War veteran. He was in Company B of the 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, and Company B was Branford's company, made up of all Branford people and some from Wallingford. Now, the Stony Creek Association was not established, obviously, in 1866. It was not established till 1906. And so it was not until 1906 that Henry Hall, the son of Alanson Hall, gave the land, which was already an established cemetery with quite a few burials at this point, to the Cemetery Association. And since 1906, it's the Stony Creek Associations that's been carefully maintaining, cataloging, and taking care of this cemetery. I think they do a very good job. Henry Hall died in 1932 at the age of 97. He lived on Hall's Point, and his second wife, Susan Wells, quite a bit younger than him, died in 1952 at the age of 97. Their son, George G. Hall, lived on Wallace Road. George Hall was an architect and designed the house on Wallace Road that formerly John Herzan and Lauren Brown lived in. His wife was Elsie Garden with a G, G-A-R-D-E-N, and she was from one of the Scottish families that came from Europe to work at the quarry. And their daughter, Alice Hall Wolochek, is buried in the cemetery in the newer section. One of the families in the old section is the Keyes family. Ernest Keyes was from Vermont, and he came to Stony Creek. They were farmers and stone cutters, and he married Sarah Hall, the daughter of Alanson Hall, who came to Stony Creek. You can start seeing all these interrelationships. It's why you never say anything bad about anybody in a little community like Stony Creek. Mrs. Keyes, or Sarah Hall Keyes, was known in Stony Creek as Mother Keyes. I mentioned the Keyes family were farmers. The next generation worked for the quarry and supervised construction all over the country for Norcross Quarry. Members of this family were Eunice Keyes Medlin, the teacher whom many of us had and many of us knew, her brother Morgan and sister Helen, and I'm sure many of you remember them. They're all buried here on this very nice Keyes monument. Another early first settler family of Stony Creek associated with the cemetery is the Howd family. Watrous Howd died in 1890 at the age of 88. This is a very nice old marble stone. And there's Watrous Howd. Watrous Avenue is named for him. His wife was Charlotte Howd. He married his cousin. They did not have any children, and she died a fairly young woman and before Stony Creek Cemetery was established, so she's buried at Damascus Cemetery. Watrous lived on Thimble Islands Road just before you get to the museum, and this was later the Keyes house, where Eunice Medlin, her brother Morgan, they lived here till the rest of their lives. Another member of the Howd family was Richard Alsop Howd. He was Watrous Howd's cousin, but also his brother-in-law by marriage. And Richard's father and grandfather are buried at Damascus Cemetery. Richard's house is right down the street from the Keyes house on Thimble Islands Road. And this is probably the oldest house in Stony Creek, though somewhat altered. You can still see the essence of that house right next to what today is the Stony Creek Museum. So as you look at this photograph, to the right, there's an empty lot, and in the 1950s, St. Teresa's Church was built there, and of course now, subsequent history, it's the museum. Members of the Howd family, of course, descendants were the late Captain Dick Howd, and currently the Howd family, there's members living here, including the Murray family. Another old-time family in that old section of the cemetery is the Bishop family. Martin Kellogg Bishop came to Stony Creek. They were sea captains, oyster dealers, and were merchants. And one of his sons, Walter Bishop, moved to Guilford, and he had a place today we know as Bishop Orchards. The other son, Nathaniel H. Bishop, which you can see on this gravestone again, was an oyster dealer. His son was George A. Bishop, and then his grandson was George E. Bishop. And they are all buried in the cemetery. By marriage, they're related to Frank Smith of Flying Point, who was president of the Oyster Company, and Nathaniel's daughter was Cora, who married John Northam. Another interesting family is the Bradley family. Franklin Bradley, before he came here, was in the Civil War. He was in Company A of the 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, and he was never well after the war. So many of these veterans became ill from diseases during the war, and he was never particularly well, and he rented out boats as a living after the war, but came here right after the war and lived down on Thimble Islands Road past Seaside Hall. His family was sons Edward, who started a well-known restaurant known as the Oasis, which burned about 30 years ago, which is now the Methodist Church. His other son was Winfield Bradley, and these men were all fishermen, and Winfield had two sons, Milton and Claire. Both of them you may remember were lobstermen, again, just past Seaside Hall. The Bradley family were one of the founders and longtime members of Stony Creek Drum Corps for several generations as drummers. One of Stony Creek's first families was the Page family, and Dennis and his wife Elmira Page lived on Hall's Point. 26 people with the last name of Page are buried in the cemetery. One of those is William Page, who died in 1907, and his wife was Rosebell Brainerd, who I mentioned earlier, the sister of John Whittlesey Brainerd, and she's the one that died at the age of 99, second oldest in the cemetery. The oldest person buried in the cemetery is Arthur Webb, who was 101. Unfortunately, Rosebell's name never got on a stone. And there's other Pages, of course. Bernie Page, whom you all knew and we knew throughout Branford because he had the sports shop in the center of town. And marrying into the Page family was the Doherty family. Daisy Artemisia Page was the daughter of Dennis and Elmira, and she married Peter Doherty, who was an Irish immigrant and worked at Beatty's Quarry in Guilford, and they're obviously buried here at the cemetery. Marrying into the Page family was Hall, Payne, Brainerd, Russell, Record, Cole, Baker, Thomas, and Tobin, all associated with the cemetery. So I've given you a little glimpse of some of the families, and you've noticed there's various styles of stones in the cemetery. Damascus is filled with these old, early 19th century marble stones, and as you may know, marble disintegrates over time, and some of them are either falling down or starting to disintegrate. This is a very nice marble stone here in your cemetery for Richard Payne and his wife Avis. Richard Payne came from Massachusetts, and he was an engraver and printer. There are also some children's stones. So this lovely marble stone, often a child would have a lamb engraved on the stone, and this is Annie Mae Wallace, the infant sister of Willoughby Wallace. There's also a few unusual stones, such as this one, which I think is just a beautiful stone in memory of Violet Gray at the age of 4. daughter of Thomas and Emily Bray from England, and he was the village blacksmith, Thomas Bray. And then there's the larger, what I call monuments. We already saw some, the Keys Monument and the Howd Monument, and there's only a couple obelisks, which is this stone. This is the Thomas Smith stone. This is the only stone that Jake and I found that was signed. And this was signed by the Philip and Sons Monument Works in New Haven, which was a large establishment that only went out of business about 30 years ago. This is the family where the fence that's in the front, the wrought iron fence in the front of the cemetery, was originally around this family plot. And the family decided to get rid of it, and the Stony Creek Association said, you know, we would like to have that, and that's how that fence ended up in the front of the cemetery. Another style of stone is cast metal. These are some of my favorite stones because the detail that you can get from these cast metal stone is just fantastic. You can see here the anchor and chain. There are 3 of these in Stony Creek Cemetery. This one is for Hezekiah Palmer. His father and grandfather are buried at Damascus Cemetery, and Hezekiah was a sea captain. He owned several sloops and schooners. And these men that were sailors, there were a lot of them in Branford. I have a record of over 200 ships that sailed out of Branford as far south as the West Indies and north to Maine. They were called coasters, the men who used these ships. We know from some seaman records that Hezekiah Palmer was 6 feet tall, so he must have cut quite a figure when he walked around Stony Creek. Now, he lived in a house right next to the cemetery on the western side that you might remember as the Sanzero house. His only child was Ellen, who married Martin Kellogg Northam. And it's Ellen who donated the back half of the cemetery to the Cemetery Association. So the cemetery is larger than it originally was. There are 16 people with the last name of Northam buried at Center Cemetery. Some of those are Bo Collins' parents, William and Eva Northam Collins, and unfortunately Eva died in the tragic convalescent home fire of 1952. The most common gravestone in Stony Creek Cemetery, because it's a relatively newer cemetery, is these machine-carved gravestones made out of granite, not Stony Creek granite. Stony Creek granite does not make an especially good material. It's a little bit porous for a gravestone. These are all Vermont granite stones, and this is the majority of the stones here at the cemetery. There's a few of these stones. This is the only stone that we know of that was carved by one of the stone carvers from the Stony Creek Quarry. There probably are others, but this is the only one that we know that has documentation. This is a fantastic stone that you can see carved by John Dower for his family. And this is a fairly large family plot with the smaller stones surrounding it. Quite a good-looking stone. And so these people came to Stony Creek specifically to work at the quarry. Now, the Stony Creek quarries were started in the mid-19th century. First, Benjamin Green had a quarry, and then later there was Red Hill, and the largest quarry was Norcross. Norcross was actually the largest quarry in the United States at one time. People came to work at the quarry from Europe. It was a place to find work. Some came from Scotland to Stony Creek, and many of these families stayed in Stony Creek and still are here today. So from Scotland, for example, the Robertson family, the Garden family, and the Milnes. Some of the families came from Italy. You know about the Dross family. There were people that came from the Scandinavian countries, all of them, Norway, Sweden, and even some from Denmark. The Hendricksons, the Laxos, and the Seastrands. But the families from Europe that had the most lasting impression concerning Stony Creek and the cemetery were those from England. And they came mostly from Cornwall, England, and also from Devonshire. There's 94 people buried in Stony Creek Cemetery that were born in England. And Cornwall, England is the farthest southwestern tip of England. It's an ancient place, had its own customs, even its own language, and is quite different from the rest of England. It was particularly known till the mid-19th century for its mines, tin mines, bronze, granite. They had a large amount of mines, so these men knew how to mine. And there's a saying in Cornwall that a mine is a hole anywhere in the world with at least one Cornishman at the bottom. And so you can see the topography of Cornwall, that Stony Creek, Cornish people did not tend to come to New England at all. They went to Australia, they went to South America, they went to Canada. Yet Stony Creek was an interesting fit, both in its shape and its geography, its topography, and that it's surrounded by water, and that it has quarries. So it's sort of a logical place that a good number of these families came. Most of the families that came to Stony Creek were from Cornwall. They came from Penryn and Gunnislake. The Bohey family, Benjamin Bohey and his father Richard Bohey, came to Stony Creek in 1871. All these men were stone cutters. And think about the kind of work that they were doing and the hazardous work that they were doing. Bohey Hill, of course, is named for them where they lived. This family is related by marriage to the Elmer Jones family. Another English family was the George family. They came to the United States in 1870, and there were two Robert Georges, both of similar ages, both of whom had lots of kids, and both of whom named their kids almost the same thing: James, George, Robert, John. So the George family is rather difficult genealogically to try to keep track of. Again, they were stone cutters. 17 people with the last name of George are buried in the cemetery. And I'd like to bring to your attention the Masonic symbol engraved on the stone. English families, for the men, were usually very involved in fraternal organizations, be it the Masons or others. And there's quite a few stones in the cemetery where they carved that important symbol that was so important to them in their adulthood. By marriage and related to the George family is the Bruton family, Record, Quick, and Vetter. Charles Opie came to the United States in 1872, and as you know, members of that family still live here in Stony Creek. And related to the Opies are, and all buried here in the cemetery, Gunther, Caddy, Erickson, Kelsey, and Krebs. One of the finest stones in Stony Creek Cemetery is the Spargo stone, and it's so similar to the Dower stone, I have to think that one of the Spargos carved this for his own family, though there's no record of that, and they were all stone carvers, so it makes sense to me. John, James, and George Spargo all came to Stony Creek. I mentioned they were all stone cutters. And related to the Spargo family was Bohey, Collins, Skidgel, Robbins, Caddy, Lacey, Maggie, and Bray. And this is a close-up of just the beautiful carving on this particular stone and the imagery. The English were not really big on this kind of imagery. This is really the only one in the cemetery that has this. Another English family was Charles Pote. This is the only stone where they said where they came from. I wished everyone did it. And you can see that Charles was proud that he came from Cowstock in Cornwall, England, but died in Stony Creek. And likewise, his wife, Grace Hutchings, was born in North Tamperton, Devonshire, England, but died in Stony Creek. Related to the Pote family are the Fraser family. And there were other Cornish families that came to Stony Creek that had a lasting presence here. Carden, that's Carden with a C, C-A-R-D-E-N, the Harding, Jenkin, Thomas, Julian, Moyle, Rogers, and the Sarah family. And then I think another important feature in the cemetery it was a little hard. There's a lot of stuff going on in the cemetery between the families and the quantity of stones to give you this glimpse of what the cemetery is about. And this is really about markers or flag holders. And there's a lot of them in Stony Creek Cemetery. I'm guessing more than some of the other cemeteries around town. And there's 2 of these lovely dove markers. And these are generally placed on a woman's gravestone, a mother or a grandmother's. And these really, there's 2 of different design at your cemetery. I mentioned the fraternal organizations that particularly the English families were involved in. This is a great marker for the Knights of Pythias, a fraternal organization. I'm not sure it's around anymore, but they were among the fraternal organizations that met at Seaside Hall. And there's 2 firemen markers. This one is for Raymond Page of Stony Creek, who was the chief of the fire department in Guilford. And then, of course, there's the Branford marker for Edward Ramos, who died in the line of duty. There's another marker that marks the tragic death of a 12-year-old Boy Scout. But the majority of the markers in Stony Creek Cemetery are for military veterans. And there's 102 veterans buried at Stony Creek, and I think that's a pretty big percentage compared to all the burials. And the Stony Creek Cemetery Association does a fantastic job cataloging these. Not an easy task, I can tell you, to know that there's someone who had military service, not just serving in a war, but having military service. This marker is for the Civil War. This is post number 7, Grand Army of the Republic. And this was the Branford after Civil War post that the veterans decided to establish in 1883. There's 6 Civil War veterans buried in Stony Creek Cemetery, no Revolutionary War veterans, because the cemetery is really too new. You have to go to Damascus to find those folks. We've already mentioned Roger Hall of the Company B 27th and Franklin Bradley, who were Civil War veterans. Another Civil War veteran is William Theodore Howd. He was in Company K of the 6th Volunteer Infantry and then was transferred to the 1st U.S. Artillery. So he was in the same company and regiment as Joseph Barker, who was buried in Damascus Cemetery. He never had a stone. And about 8 years ago, the Stony Creek Cemetery Association applied to get the stone from the government. And this is a typical military stone provided by the veterans of the U.S. government, free of charge to any military veteran. And this is the current and newer style military stone. So there's quite a few of these in Stony Creek Cemetery. Another Civil War veteran was Richard Payne, Jr., and he was also in Company K of the 6th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. So you can see that neighborhood guys, they often knew each other and in groups went and enlisted. So they ended up in the same regiments. He was the brother-in-law of Roger Hall, the other Civil War veteran. Richard Payne became ill during the Civil War, contracted several illnesses, and was never well again. He died in 1891, and he was an engraver like his father. But this family, Richard Jr., started something that you remember as Payne's Store. His wife was Maria Page, the daughter of Dennis and Elmira, and the sister of Daisy Page Doherty. And she was the Stony Creek postmistress for many years, followed by her son, Roland Page, and Roland Payne. And it's a little hard to keep all this straight, believe me. She died in 1937 at the age of 97. Another Civil War veteran that's very interesting, buried here in Stony Creek Cemetery, is Elias Norton. And he was in the 1st Light Battery, and this was a Connecticut Volunteer Infantry group, and he was from Guilford. The history of the First Light Battery quotes him because he kept a diary, so he's highly quoted, so we know quite a bit about his military service, and copies of his and his brother's letters are at the Guilford Free Library. Fascinating what these young men talked about when they were serving in the military. All the Norton families buried in Guilford, and why Elias is buried here, I don't know, except that his wife was Anna Smith, the daughter of Thomas Smith, whom I showed that obelisk gravestone of, but they all lived in Guilford. They never lived in Stony Creek, and I don't know why they chose to be buried here. Maybe they had a family fight or something, and they... and perhaps locally the most famous Civil War veteran is James Newlen, N-O-U-L-E-N. It is said that he was a Civil War veteran. Not only that he was a Confederate soldier. And he definitely died in Branford. There's a brief record of him in the vital records. It just gives his date of death and age. It doesn't tell anything else about him except that he was born in Ireland. It does say on the top of his own husband, so he must have been married at the time of his death. Somewhere along the line, somebody said he was a Confederate soldier. I cannot find any record. I can't find any document. Nothing. So the tradition is that we have a Confederate soldier buried here in Stony Creek, and he's honored by the Stony Creek Cemetery Association with both an American and Confederate flag. And a tradition, I think, that should continue unless we know otherwise. I did not mention that the Stony Creek Association, probably through the Boy Scouts, does a great job honoring all these military veterans, both at Veterans Day and Memorial Day. I'll also note that there's a Masonic symbol on James Newland's stone. A rather forgotten war is the Spanish-American War, or the just Spanish War. And this war was in 1898, lasted till 1902, and we're celebrating or honoring the 125th anniversary of that conflict. And there was already, by 1898, conflict between Spain and the United States, particularly over the harbor outside of Cuba, because of our interest in Cuba and Florida. And you, of course, have heard of the sinking of the Maine, the battleship, the Maine, and that really escalated the start of this war. And to this day, there's controversy how the Maine sunk, whether it exploded, the furnace exploded, if the Spanish really did it, or did our government do it to prompt the war. You know, there's all kinds of speculation, but you've all heard Save the Mainers, the sinking of the Maine. And so there's a couple Stony Creek veterans that are buried here. This is a fantastic gravestone for Wesley Collins, and this is the old style military government stone where you can see he was in the Philippine insurrection during the Spanish-American War in the 35th U.S. Infantry. And at his gravestone is this wonderful flag marker that honors his service in the Spanish War. And you can see here, this is how we got Puerto Rico with the old spelling P-O-R-T-O. This is how Cuba got their independence from Spain, and that we annexed the Philippine Islands. Another Spanish-American War veteran buried in Stony Creek Cemetery was George Allen, and him and his wife were very instrumental in the founding of the Stony Creek Theater. And then, of course, there's World War I. 20 men from Stony Creek are buried in Stony Creek Cemetery that served in World War I. And almost all these veterans' names are also on the monuments on your green just across the street. Again, a current military stone. Another World War I veteran was James Milne. He came from, this family came from Scotland, and he was married to Florence Brainerd. And they lived on Main Street, what you call now Thimble Islands Road, right next to the Brainerd department store. And there's quite a few of these American Legion flag markers of various styles. And obviously, the most veterans buried in Stony Creek Cemetery are those from World War II. There's 56 men from World War II buried here, even though women were serving, and there were several women from Stony Creek that served in World War II. None of them are buried in the cemetery. And this is a World War I marker. You can see it has the old term World War because it was supposed to be the last war. But this is the most common marker in Stony Creek Cemetery used for both World War I and World War II veterans. And so there's many Stony Creek men from World War II of all branches of the service, such as Ralph Lindsley in the Navy, and William Dowd, who was in the Army. And there's only 2 or 3 of these rather rare actual World War II markers, which I think are very good looking with the eagle, but they don't hold up over time. You can see they get rusty. And there's 11 men buried here from the Korean War. And no doubt there could be more as time goes on. The men that served in Korea are now in their late 80s and into their 90s. And there's, as I say, 11 buried here in the cemetery, one of which is Mildred Zanzaro, who was married to Howard Zanzaro, and she is the only female military veteran buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. And already now one Vietnam veteran. And the people that served in Vietnam, of course I remember them going off to war, are in their mid to late 60s, and some in their early 70s. And I'm sure as time goes on, this is an active cemetery, that they'll be hard to think that Vietnam veterans are now in their mid to late 60s, but that's time does march on. Cemeteries, one might think, are depressing places, but in actuality they're filled with history. They're really quite beautiful. And take a look around at the beauty of the grounds and the beauty of the stones and what those stones mean. And so we set out to catalog, and I think we were successful, Jake, to catalog and photograph, but mostly to tell the story of the families and the relationships of those families in this particular community. And so the history of your cemetery is unlike anywhere else. So there's 190 burials, burials with no stone and no name. That's a lot. And Bo Collins started that project to try to identify where these people are within the cemetery. Now, how do we know there's 190 people? We use the cemetery records themselves. The cemetery records didn't start till 1906. So there's no early maps, there's no early photographs. We only have the documents for about, the last 100+ years. Nothing earlier from that. There's no deeds and no plots in the town records. So you have to kind of use a lot of resources to figure this stuff out. So we use obituaries. They may say someone was buried in Stony Creek Cemetery, but there are sexton records at the Branford Town Hall starting in 1885 where it says where the person was buried. And that's largely how we know some of these burials. So 190 people that were sort of unaccounted for. Bo Collins did a lot of this work already, but by examining family relationships, we made some corrections, and we got it down to about 39 people buried in the cemetery. We were really not quite sure where they are. There is on the earlier maps a pauper section, and it's possible that some of those individuals are in that section. In 1934, there was a statewide cemetery project called the Hale Collection, and this was done during the end of the Depression as a works project administration project. And they went around Connecticut and documented all the stones and what's on the stones in every cemetery in Connecticut, except not Catholic cemeteries. And so we have that document. And so from 1934, one stone was missing. 2 stones were missing. One we found, and it was lost, and it got put back. And there was one other stone from 1934 that's no longer there. And so we don't know, was that person disinterred, buried somewhere else? but there's no record of it. So we did pretty good. We're down to 39 people that we can't quite account for. And so because this is an active cemetery, there's certainly more stories to be told and more stories yet to be told. I didn't really talk about, you know the stories more than me, about marriages that didn't last, and there were other tragedies, drownings, and quarry accidents. And mostly about families, but about Stony Creek characters. And a village like Stony Creek attracts a lot of characters. And so a lot of those characters are buried in Stony Creek cemeteries, and a lot more Stony Creek characters are going to be buried there. So we'll tell their story maybe in the future. And there's always, when you do cemetery work, there's always some mysteries. Who are some of these people? It takes a lot of sort of sleuth and detective work. And so there's 3 or 4 of these mysteries that we didn't solve. Who are these people and why are they here? I could not find any documentation of their life, their death, and why are they buried in Stony Creek Cemetery. So you always have these mysteries. And one of these is the Hunter family. George Hunter, you know, we know he died and so on. His wife was like 30 years older than him, and they're buried in Stony Creek Cemetery, and just can find no record of their presence here, even their presence here in the summer. And why are they here? I'd like to know. So I hope you enjoy the tour. Do stop at the cemetery. It's a great place, and it's a wonderful place, and do walk around. Thank you very much.